It's been a long week. Resuming debate.
The honourable member for Sturgeon River Parkland.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'm proud to rise today to speak on Bill C-396, an act to amend the Department of Industry Act regarding financial assistance. And I was honoured to accept an invitation to speak on this private member's bill proposed by my colleague, the honourable member from the Beauce, whom I proudly serve with on the Committee for Industry, Science and Technology. This bill is an important step to ensuring accountability when taxpayer resources are used to subsidize private companies, whether that be through loans or other guarantees. Now, the purpose of this bill is to ensure that companies that receive repayable financial assistance provide that information to the government so that it can be publicly shared with Canadians. Currently, when Canadian government subsidizes through repayable assistance, Canadians have little means of knowing whether or not those companies have repaid those loans to taxpayers. And this lack of accountability means that the government can extend taxpayer resources with little oversight from parliamentarians and Canadians. And this lack of transparency is a scandal waiting to happen. And I believe this simple legislation can help ensure that the resources are being spent in an appropriate manner so Canadian taxpayers can have the confidence that they will be repaid. Canadians' hard-earned tax dollars are being used to offer loans for corporations. Therefore, Canadians have a right to transparency on how those companies will pay those loans back. No bank would loan money to anyone without a reasonable expectation of return and a plan to have those funds repaid. Yet all too often, what starts off as a government loan very quickly becomes a government grant. And if Canadian taxpayers are expected to get in the business of financing private ventures, every taxpayer, like a shareholder in any private company, deserves quarterly reports on how those resources are being spent. One case in particular comes to mind when debating this issue, and that being the repayable loan of $375 million over 4 years paid to Bombardier by this Liberal government. Now, this payment may have been necessary to support a Canadian company, but surely taxpayers are owed accountability in terms of how these funds are being spent and how they will be repaid. And when my honourable colleague from the Beauce asked the government for further information on the terms and conditions of this loan payment, he was denied that information. And in effect, Canadians were denied the right to judge the government on its use of taxpayer resources. Now let's look at what's changed since then. In the last 2 years, Bombardier's share price has significantly improved, more than doubling, and yet Canadians don't have the information to judge whether the investment in loans by the federal government was worth the cost. In fact, there's been considerable movement on this file, as the C-Series jet, which the government spent hundreds of millions to invest in, was bought by European conglomerate Airbus after struggling to reach sales targets. Jobs and investment have now left Canada, and facilities to construct these taxpayer-subsidized jets are being built in Alabama. Canadians deserve to know how companies that receive taxpayer funds will pay back those funds and how they will be using those funds. Now, the case of Bombardier is certainly not isolated. In fact, nearly 200 companies have received $700 million of taxpayer assistance. But other than that headline number, there is little accountability for taxpayers. How many jobs are these projects creating? How much are these investments stimulating our economy? When will those loans be repaid to the taxpayer? These are all good questions, Madam Speaker. Questions that could be better answered should Bill C-396 be passed. Now, I want to take a second to recognize that government investment can be very necessary in limited circumstances. I think of the bailout of our auto industry during the last financial crisis, where the previous Conservative government invested in shares that provided value to taxpayers, saved jobs in Ontario and across Canada, and ensured that automotive investment stayed in Canada. Canadians have a right to information regarding these deals because an informed citizenry is essential to a healthy democracy. And I'm proud of the work that my colleague, the honourable member of the Beauce, did when he served as Minister of Industry in 2006 and 2007. He published information regarding these loans, the amount and the conditions for repayment, because and due to this, many of the companies actually started repaying the loans due to the public pressure. Now, I understand that there may be some worries about Canada's competitive advantage should this legislation pass. However, the principle of accountability must trump all other considerations. In fact, I believe that accountability is a foundational principle for all actions undertaken by government. And if Canada demonstrates an increased level of openness and transparency, we can set an example for other nations. This accountability will ensure that when government undertakes financial assistance activities that meet the appropriate threshold under international law, that we can be certain that these will be good subsidies. And this is an example that Canada should set and the world should follow. You know, many times Canadian companies like Bombardier are unfairly attacked by foreign competitors that receive subsidies from their respective governments. If Canada passes C-396, we will be showing the world that we have nothing to hide when we provide financial assistance to our companies. And there are many cases where financial assistance to companies can even achieve legitimate policy ends. I think of the construction of railroads across this great nation that could not have been achieved without significant government support. And there is no reason why this financial support cannot provide a net benefit to taxpayers. For example, in May 2013, Sandvine Incorporated was given a loan of $9.5 million and later paid back $14 million. Not only were taxpayers given their money back, but the deal helped this company to generate jobs and create economic value for Canadians. We must always place as a priority, however, that government are not driven by political consideration or emotion, but instead by hard facts. Providing grants or so-called repayable loans to private companies should be absolutely the last resort. Instead, government should seek to build the foundation that allows private investment to thrive in an environment that emphasizes free markets. And it's not the job of the government to pick winners and losers. And if the Liberals have decided that they want to pick winners with taxpayers' money, the least they can do is provide transparency on how taxpayers will be repaid. And this bill will create that transparency, and it will provide accountability for companies so that they will be compelled to repay their loans, rather than hiding in the darkness of government secrecy. And I suspect that this Liberal government will vote against this bill that provides greater transparency, which is a real shame, because this is a party that campaigned on doing politics differently. And sadly, as soon as the dust settled after the election, we quickly realized that it was business as usual with the same old Liberal Party. The train of pork emanating from this government is simply astounding. At a time of global economic expansion, foreign investment is leaving our country at a record pace, and the Liberals are using taxpayer resources to try and stem the tide, unsuccessfully. And the problem is that when the economy is growing, it's fairly easy to run deficits, but when the economy inevitably contracts, the taxpayer will be left on the hook for these loans. And during the last economic crisis, Conservatives acted in our national interest and injected an unprecedented amount into our economy. We saved the auto industry in this country, and we ensured that our country became the first out of the G7 to come out of the recession. And that is a record that we can be proud of. And let's remember, however, that this fiscal flexibility was only possible because of over a decade and decades of Liberal and Conservative fiscal prudence. And that fiscal prudence balanced Canada's budget in 2015 and would have ensured that Canada would be well placed to weather future economic storms. Unfortunately, this government has used these good economic times to expand spending at a rate that goes beyond sustainability. They are replacing private investment with taxpayers' funds, but without the same oversight that investors in private companies can expect. Bill C-396 is an important step because when Canadians get transparency and accountability, they can judge the government's actions. And when decisions are made in a shrouded manner, it takes an extraordinary amount of effort by taxpayers and parliamentarians to get to the truth. And the government counts on this lack of transparency to get away with giving repayable loans that are often or never repaid, loans which Canadians have a right to examine and question. In conclusion, I strongly support Bill C-396 because as accountability is the foundation of a free and democratic society, so too is the right of Canadians to examine and pass judgment on government assistance to private companies. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Reprise de débat.